Kia ora, everyone. So, for those of you listening, we have an awesome conversation, and really, it is the idea of diversity in tech, a huge, important one when you think about solving the world's complex problems that will grip us moving forward, especially as young New Zealanders. The way that we've broken this podcast down is first, we understood the current state of diversity in tech. We had conversations on who is marginalized and where we're lacking. We then moved on to even understanding why diversity is important, from the benefits and how that even promotes business value and productivity. And then moving forward, we strategized, finding ways that are practical but also higher level in tackling this huge problem. And so stay tuned the whole podcast. It's not even that long. It's about 20 to 30 minutes commute time, and you'll learn a lot. And for those that are Flint members, please join us for our Future is Now conference, which is on the 19th of September. And the reason why I bring this up is because one of the keynote speakers is diversity in tech. And so you'll love it. It's the Flint Auckland conference. Future is Now. So join us. Welcome to our second Flint Talks podcast. It's going to be an interesting one. We're going to talk about a topic that's dear to my heart, but I'm sure it's dear to everyone. And it is to do with diversity in technology. There's some really important arguments to be said, and I hope my fellow colleagues can help me understand this topic together. Before we start, I'll introduce. I'm Derek. I work at Air New Zealand as a DevOps engineer. What about you, Caitlin? What is your role?
I'm Caitlin and I work for a company called Intuito. We're an online learning platform and I run the customer success department. Caius?
Yes, that's what they call me. I'm Caius. I work for Fujitsu, which is not the heat pump company, or an IT service provider, and I'm in the account management sales team.
Well, that's awesome. And so right there, we can see a diverse group of people in different industries. I want to ask the first question, which I think is a common one. What are the specific areas that are underrepresented when we are talking about diversity in tech? Because I can make an assumption, but I want to hear it from you first, Caius. What are your thoughts?
For me, from what I see, a lot of it is in the, how do I put this politically correctly, the ethnic minority group. I consider myself an ethnic minority group, and there isn't a whole bunch of representation. A bunch of the IT industry, in my view, is a Pākehā and on the older side. So that is my unpolitically correct way of saying it. Keen to hear from yourself, Caitlin. Did I hit it on the head? Do you want to challenge me?
Not challenge per se, but just definitely add to that. I'm a stats girl, so I've been doing a little bit of research in preparation for this episode. And there were some big studies done, unfortunately, just before the pandemic. So now they're a few years old. But looking at the technology industry as a whole, we were looking at only between 25 and 30% female in the technology sector. So, that's way below the 50-ish% you'd expect if everything was nice and equal. But then, jumping down into those ethnic minority kind of statistics, we're looking at only a couple of percent Māori Pacific Islander in the technology sector as a whole across both men and women. So definitely gender diversity is an issue, but that ethnicity is really not equal at all either.
Totally. I relate because I studied engineering and there was not many females or ethnic people that were, in particularly where I studied, which is University of Canterbury, although an amazing engineering college, it just wasn't there in terms of the female representation for sure. And then further moving into the software engineering developer role, which I think is one of the most important roles that you can do moving forward in this world, that where is our representation there? And so I want to ask, why do you think that is? Why don't we have more females interested in science, technology, mathematics? Any ideas, Caitlin?
Well, for me, I guess a bit of background. I never was interested in working in tech. This job that I've got now is my first role in a technology company as such. I've kind of worked on the fringes for a little while, but this was really the first company that identifies as a technology or software company. And a big part of that, I think, for me personally, is growing up, I just didn't see women working in tech. So it was never really something I even considered as a career. There was a lot of the teachers and the nurses and big healthcare push. And maybe that was just the area I grew up in South Auckland, was very trade focused, I guess. So you never really saw those soft skills or the more kind of technology focused roles really happening. But yeah, personally for me, you didn't see women working in them. So it didn't seem an option for me growing up.
There's like this essentially awareness piece, right? Because you only know what you know. So just not
Exactly.
being exposed is a huge part. So I want to come to you, Kais, and ask this one because you touched on the ethnic side. What other particular challenges do you feel our ethnic communities face in our tech industry that are limiting that diversity?
I'm going to give you a broader example, and it's a thing that I go back and forth with because it brings up the whole tokenism quota versus merit on opportunities and jobs. So I personally believe that the best person for the job should have the job or should have the opportunity, assuming everyone has equal access to the opportunities that lead up before it. I think a big one for me is education. If you don't have access to the same level of education, then you're at an inherent disadvantage. Now, I think if you look at it from a migrant perspective, one of the scenarios that I see a lot is migrants who come here from overseas and they're first generation migrants. They don't have a whole bunch of social capital. They don't understand, or they don't have the network where someone, is in the IT industry. They have a mate of a mate of a mate who they once played football with who's now hiring a job. And so a lot of the time I'm seeing a whole bunch of ethnic minorities, people who are highly skilled in their own countries, fall through the cracks. So they fall through the cracks because they don't have that network, and a lot of the time their education or their qualifications aren't qualified. So I think that's not specifically just an IT issue. It's a broader problem, but that's one of the things that I see that goes on with and contributes to the lack of it. Plus, there is also less of us. So naturally, there will be less.
I see. No, very interesting points that you made, especially about meritocracy. And I want to touch on that one in particular because sure, I do agree with the fact that if you have the skills and you have the knowledge, then you should deserve the position. But we can also agree that everyone starts at a different playing field in life. So by that nature, meritocracy is also bias. So that's my initial view. Caitlin, what are your views?
Yeah, so that's an interesting point. Being someone that was born here and has luckily grown up with some great connections due to the color of my skin. White privilege is a thing, it is real, and I 100% acknowledge that I have it. Growing up in South Auckland, I saw lots of people that didn't have it that were just as capable and as smart as me, not being offered the same opportunities as me. And it sucked, but there's not really much you can do about it as a kid other than acknowledge that it's there and then, try and do something about it when you're older for the people to come. And I definitely saw that when I was looking at hiring people for my team. So we did a hiring push towards the start of last year, maybe something like that. And seeing the CVs and things coming through, it was very clear that there were people that thought they were right for the role and people that were applying for it in the hopes that they would be right, even though they were still perfect. And I think a lot of that as well just comes down to confidence. You can have the skills, or you might not have the skills, but you think you do. So you're way more likely to go for a position or try for something. And I think that's where people that have that network thrive, because they have the people building them up to believe that they are good, even though someone else might not be better. If that makes sense. I don't know if I'm
No,
rambling.
I do understand. It's an interesting way of viewing it, especially talking about connections there, because New Zealand is a tiny village. And so if you are, well connected, you are already immediately stronger than a lot of people in terms of opportunities. And so I wanted to ask this question, guys. Do you think New Zealand has an unfair advantage because of our small village capability in terms of our nepotism and connections? Or is that just a nature of humanity that it's like that everywhere we go outside New Zealand?
I think I've only lived in New Zealand. I've lived in New Zealand my whole life. I've been fortunate to have that privilege. So it's kind of hard to say. I think based on what I do know of other countries, it's almost the same but different. There are different challenges in the other countries. And when you speak about nepotism and connections here, there's another word for it in other countries. You can call it in more, what's the word? In more communal based societies, then you could, rather than say nepotism, you could just say, well, part of the community or part of the tribe. So I don't have a great answer for that, I know, because I've only really seen one culture intimately and seen a bit of other cultures. So
yeah. Of course. What about you, Caitlin? What are your thoughts on that?
Like Kaius, I've only worked in New Zealand. So again, I don't have any personal experience on this, but I do have a lot of friends that have moved overseas to the UK especially.
Yeah.
And yeah, what they've found, or what the friends of mine, at least, not talking as a whole, obviously, but they've found that people actually respect or revere the New Zealand qualifications quite a bit. They put a lot of weight behind them. And I don't know if maybe that's just because people love New Zealand in the UK and they love coming and traveling here. So they just think everyone from here is great. Or if it's just because our universities are really well considered around the world, or if it's a mixture of we've put so many good businesses out into the world that people just instantly associate New Zealand technology workers with those amazing companies. So then by association, we must be good. But what I've heard is that people really value New Zealanders, New Zealand education, and New Zealand technology workers, especially. And maybe that's why everyone's scared that we're going to run across the ditch.
Of course. I think we've got a good understanding of the current state from our perspective, from young New Zealanders. And so I want to go towards understanding why even diversity is beneficial. I understand why, but I just want to invoke this conversation. And so the way I'm going to put it is I'm going to company, I'm a hiring manager, and I see this one particular really smart person, and I think, well, why does diversity matter? Why can't I just duplicate that same person over and over again to achieve my solution, which is going against the diversity argument? So I want to pose that to you guys. What do you answer to that?
I've always had success in my life when I've looked at things from two different or alternate perspectives and distill it down into the values that each other holds, and then find a medium between them. Because I find it a lot of cultures, and let's use the example of cultures. A lot of cultures look at the same thing two different ways, but a lot of the time when you distill down the fundamental human need, which is things like safety, family, love, freedom, it's quite similar. It's just looked at in different ways. So I think if companies can foster a culture where different perspectives are encouraged and allowed and they're not cancelled, then you can get some incredibly creative ideas. I mean, one book I was reading recently was talking about creativity in the sense that you don't actually have to go and create anything new. Quite often, a lot of people just go to a different culture, find something that hasn't been done in their homeland, and then just bring it back, and all of a sudden they're a genius in their society. So it's just about trying to find a happy medium between different perspectives in a constructive way, which can be hard in society. So I understand that it comes with the collision path in many ways, which I'd be keen to touch on later on. But I think if I look at it purely from a beneficial perspective, that would be one of the biggest benefits.
Of course, I agree as well. Caitlin, have you experienced this cultural differences that have enabled you to solve some complex problems?
Yeah, definitely. In previous roles and the role I'm in now, I think part of at least what I bring to the table in my current position is the ability to challenge the thinking. Coming from a non-tech background, one of the big things that, or I hope the team values me for, is the ability to see things from a perspective of someone that potentially doesn't understand the technology behind it, and say, okay, someone that knows coding will 100% know what this is, what this button does, why this button's here. But someone that doesn't, which is the majority of our user base potentially, how would they know what to do when they get to this point? And I think that's where the different backgrounds, the diversity really comes in, because if you've got 10 very technical software engineers building a product, and then you don't have anyone from any other background or perspective looking at it, you're going to end up with a product designed by software engineers for software engineers. And sure, that might be what your product is, but when you think about the small percentage of the world that are software engineers, you're really limiting your customer base. So if you're wanting to grow, you need to make it available to more people, and you're never going to be able to do that if you don't have the people from that community's input, or you're never going to be able to do it well anyway. And so that's where that diversity comes in, and that can be applied to products across the board, not just technology. You need to have the input from your end customer to be able to build a product for them. And yeah, you can't have that if everyone is just a tech person.
I think that's one of the main reasons we wanted you to come on board with this podcast. It would have just been a couple of nerds, Kais and I, talking, and we needed your perspective. So I want to add to this. The world is becoming increasingly more complex. And so if you have a solution that you know the requirements for and the exact output, then you can duplicate whatever person you want. But that is never the case. And that will never be the case moving forward, especially with the uncertainties we face in our world. So having diversity, having those cultural mindsets, having those perspectives that we don't understand is the only way to solve a problem moving forward. And so that is why I see it's one of the biggest benefits. And companies should, if they want to build successful competitive solutions and stay competitive, then they need it. It's not a checkbox item, in my opinion.
Absolutely. No, I completely agree, Derek.
So we've understood the benefits, and that's amazing. So what are potential products and solutions that tend to be biased, that need more diverse input? And I want to pose that over to you guys. Do you have any ideas?
I do, and I've changed my perspective on this recently. So when you say products and solutions, let's use AI for an example. A lot of people go on about AI and how the AI is inherently biased, but I would argue and disagree that AI is not inherently biased. It's the data that's put in by the people that is inherently biased. So I'm more concerned about the people making the products rather than the products themselves, if you know what I mean. In terms of real life examples, I don't actually have one off the top of my head. So Caitlin, can you bail me out here?
I guess one thing, I'm a bit of a fitness person at the moment, you guys know, but I've been doing a lot of online programming and things for my gym, bits and pieces. I mean, one thing I found is that almost every app I've used has male body examples of the exercises and things.
Totally.
And that's the default, and you actually have to work to find a female version, because I'm always like, okay, well, I physically cannot do that thing because my body does not do that. I've actually had to put effort in to go and find the female versions of some of the things, and that's probably a very niche example, but just something that has come up recently. And I've been really lucky to actually have found a really great trainer that specializes in the area of fitness I'm doing. So she's amazing. But yeah, I was just looking at other things and going, wow, the amount of women that might be starting the gym for the first time and have decided to go for an online trainer that would be put off because they don't see themselves. That's just something very simple that could very easily be changed, but it's male dominated industry as well, the fitness industry.
Totally.
And so a very good example, even though potentially not a tech example. But
I still think it is tech, because it brings in the idea of how do you design your applications, like who is your majority user base, and even there's bias, and the diverse mindsets that could have worked on it would have added that feature that could have inevitably made the whole experience better. But even, Kais, I don't think you touched on a very simple one there. The bias in AI is probably one of the biggest things we have to consider moving forward. So really, like, I think that is where diversity is so important. We don't want just a bunch of software engineers creating these AI systems that will inevitably change how we think and view the world, because that's how it is. That's how our algorithms work in social media. And so I can only see it being one of the biggest points to worry about. So why don't I move on to how do we strategize? Because we've understood what our current state is. We understand the benefits very clearly now. So what can we do, especially as young engineers or young people in the tech industry? How do we start to solve this problem is my question, and it's a big one.
It's a huge one, mate. I should go for Prime Minister if I nail this one. Speaking of politics, it is a bit of a side interest. I'll put it on the record. If you knew me from about 16 to 17, you'd know that I'd always said I'd run for Prime Minister as a joke. But if I didn't get Prime Minister, I'd do Ministry of Education. And this is exactly where I'm going with this. So I think purely from a domestic standpoint, I look at school kids who are out in the regions and they don't necessarily have the same access. I think regional school kids is another form of diversity which we can tap into, because everyone knows quite often where you live is a determinant of race in some ways, or culture. So I think if schools and education systems were to move towards more of a online learning system where we actually recognize qualifications and have full-on accreditations via online sources or platforms, that would be a huge help. I also think that if, in order to encourage this, organizations need to fully embrace remote work. And I know ever since COVID, remote work has been an increasing thing, but I don't quite believe organizations have fully accepted it, or at least not every organization, or not enough organizations have accepted it to my liking at the very least. And so I think if you could incorporate a whole culture where this remote world is fully embraced, you would have access, or you would have a way larger pool of people to choose from and to then have different perspectives. And we could even broaden this out to bigger and better things, like we could even go, how do New Zealand companies become more diverse, rather than waiting on Immigration New Zealand to update their quotas or decide how many migrants they want to bring in. If we're looking at a migrants or skilled worker perspective, you could just go, well, what are the time zones that are useful for New Zealand? Then we can hire remotely from there. You could even run a 24-hour day where whatever country logs in, as soon as New Zealand logs off at 5 p.m, you could start building these great systems where you just got access to an incredible bunch of resources without having to complicate it as much. So that's my long-winded answer to your question.
That's a big question, so it deserves a big answer. I agree. Education is access, and that's clearly put there. What are initiatives and programs that you believe, Caitlin, improve diversity in these companies, especially tech industries, which is where we need that?
Yeah, and so many people go on about programs for getting people already in the workforce into these companies, but I believe it needs to start so much earlier than that. We need to be looking at kids when they're in high school, because so much of what you can do, especially as a young adult, is determined by the subject you did at school, what you studied at university, all that kind
So
of
true.
stuff.
Yeah.
And so thinking about how to get children and young people excited about not just tech roles, but diverse roles across the workforce in general is something that we need to do more of, and something that quite a few companies and organizations are trying to do at the moment. One that I do want to shout out real quickly is a program called Inspiring the Future. What they do is they create an online pool of people in the workforce, and schools or learning organizations can pick and choose these people to come and do a day where you talk to the kids or whoever it might be about what you do, how you got into it, what opportunities there are, that kind of thing. And what they do is so cool, because they go out into these smaller towns, these small organizations where maybe a kid's never seen or heard of a software engineer before, but a guy or a girl has rocked up with their laptop and said, yeah, this is what I do all day. This is how I got into it. These are the opportunities I've got to grow. And it opens the eyes and the world of these kids that may never have known that that career was a possibility. And yeah, that's a great thing. And it's all based on people like the three of us saying, hey, I'd love to do more, and taking a day out of the year or a half a day out of the year to go and inspire the future, which is why it's called Inspiring the Future.
I absolutely love that, because the only reason why I wanted to become a software engineer was because someone my age showed me how a motherboard worked. Like, he opened up a computer and pulled out the component, and I looked at it and I was like, wow, that's amazing. And ever since then, I wanted to be an engineer. And you're right, you have to do it very early, because the further you grow in life, there's more societal pressures and more ways to conform, and that kind of changes your view. And so you want to get it when they're impressionable and when their spark and imagination is huge. So I totally agree. Yeah,
absolutely. And I mean, there's so many opportunities to have a second career in your life now. So even if you get to mid-30s, 40s and decide, oh, actually I want to switch, there's the opportunity to do that. It's just harder because you might already have a family that depend on you. You might have that mortgage that you have to keep paying for.
yeah,
You might
totally.
have all these other things. Whereas, when you're younger, you don't necessarily have the debt, or potentially you still live at home. You don't have to pay the rent. You're not that pressured. You've got that opportunity to try out a few things. We've got opportunities for fees-free study and internships and all of these other things that will open up doors to so many future things that you just potentially don't have when you're a little bit older. And touching on what you said about your own story, Derek, is that it was someone our age. And I think that's also really important, because you get spoken to by your teachers and your principal and your guidance counselors at school, and you're 15, 16 and they're 40, 50, 60, and you're kind of like, oh, dinosaur, what did they know? But someone our age that we're like, oh yeah, that's a cool young person living life. Like you get excited about them, and then they validate you could do this. Like, wow, I could be like them.
I totally agree.
It's just such a different message, I think, when it comes from someone that is a bit closer to your age, because you feel like it could be a reality.
Yeah, totally. I also want to touch on another strategy, which is seeing leaders, diverse leaders, is a huge influencer for anyone that wants to even become a leader themselves or promote diversity within an organization. Because I think leadership trickles down. We know the organizational structures. A strong leader has huge influence in how an organization works. And if you see a person that is diverse, and also furthermore, the characteristic of autonomy, because I have been in companies that are not autonomous, and it does not promote diversity. It's an illusion of I'm making progress by making sure that I know exactly what my employees are doing. But no, in fact, you need to trust your individual and let them do the work. And that's where their creativity and diversity comes into effect. So I think another strategy, and I think it's a bit more of a high level strategy, it's not as practical as what you offered, Caitlin and Caius, but it's that we have diverse leaders, and they show us how organizations can promote diverse mindsets.
I do agree with you, but I do want to ask you on your perspective there, Derek, on the idea of quotas versus actual meritocracy, then, seeing as you raised that we should put more diverse people in leadership positions. So where do you stand on that? Give me your take.
Very interesting. I think you definitely have to have the skills and the connections in order to be a strong leader. But what I believe, and we go fundamental, is understand your bias. So as a hiring manager, or even as a human being, just understand that you have many biases. I think there's about 20 to 25 psychological biases, and just understand them when you apply to take on someone in a very consequential role. And that will have butterfly and flow-on effects on diversity. I think that's it. We all have biases, but as long as we understand them, then we can solve, hopefully, the bigger problems.
Yeah, I completely agree with that, Derek. Quotas and things can only go so far, because in a way that they can also negatively affect diversity, because you're hiring people that then the rest of the people in the company may not believe should be there, and then that creates negative mindsets and that kind of thing. Whereas if the hiring team actively thinking, okay, we know the group of us have this bias because we come from this specific background, so we are going to actively work to give people that potentially have faced bias the opportunity to work at this company, then the company will be better off for it. It may take a little bit longer to get there, but I think getting there a bit more naturally in some cases is more beneficial and more productive as well.
Perfect. I think that honestly wraps it up. Thank you, team. And I want to thank TUANZ for supporting and giving us resources to create this podcast. And I want to thank Intuito for giving us the mics that you'll be able to hear us today. If anyone listening has ideas, please send them over to us because we want to hear from you. So I think that's it. And thank you, team. Great ideas.